The garage had its own smell, motor oil and old leather, and something else I never found a word for, something particular to that space, that car, that man. Timothy used to say the smell was just time. That's what 40 years of Sundays smells like, blossom. He wasn't wrong. We'd spent more Sundays in that garage than I could count, him on his back under the Mustang with his legs sticking out like he'd been swallowed. Me handing him tools I only half knew the names of, learning them slowly, year by year, until I knew them all. The 67 Fastback was Highland green, the same color as the one in Bullitt, which Timothy had seen 11 times in the theater as a boy and never fully recovered from. He'd found her in a salvage yard in 1987, a rusted shell with no engine and one door hanging off, and he'd spent the better part of 2 decades making her whole. I say he, but that's not quite right. I stripped the chrome with him. I helped sand the body panels on a July afternoon when it was 94 degrees, and we were both sunburned and furious and laughing. When he finally started her engine for the first time, a Sunday in October, leaves blowing through the open garage door, he looked at me and said, "We did it, Blossom," and I cried, which surprised us both. Timothy died 14 months ago. Heart attack, February, the kind that doesn't give you much notice. He was here and then he was not, and the house became a different kind of place entirely. I kept the garage locked. I noticed the car was gone on a Tuesday morning in April. I'd gone out to the garage the way I sometimes did, not to do anything in particular, but just to be near it, near him. And the space where the Mustang had lived for 36 years was empty. I stood in the doorway for a long time. I thought I was misremembering. I thought, for a disorienting moment, that I'd imagined the car entirely, that grief had done something strange to my memory. Then I saw the oil stain on the concrete, the exact shape of her undercarriage, and I knew the car was real and the car was gone. I called Sean. He didn't answer. I called again. He answered on the 4th ring, his voice slightly too casual, slightly too practiced. "Hey, Mom." "The Mustang is gone," I said. A pause. "Yeah, I was going to talk to you about that." They came over that evening, Sean and Fanny, his wife of 3 years. Fanny always came when there was difficult news to deliver. I had come to understand this about her without ever putting it plainly to myself. She was better at managing conversations than Sean was, better at controlling the temperature of a room. She was 40, 10 years younger than my son, with dark hair she wore in a careful knot, and a way of tilting her head when she listened to you that made you feel heard, and later, when you thought about it more carefully, observed. They sat at my kitchen table. I put coffee on because I needed something to do with my hands. "I sold the car," Sean said. He said it directly, which surprised me. I'd expected more preamble. "I see," I said. "Fanny and I have been going through a hard time financially." "The market's been brutal," Fanny said, with a small, sympathetic smile directed at me. "And we've been talking for years about taking a proper trip, something meaningful, and Paris felt." "You sold your father's car," I said, "to go to Paris." The silence that followed was of a specific texture. Sean had the grace to look ashamed. Fanny held her expression very steadily, which I noticed. "I know it wasn't my car to sell," Sean said, "but technically with the estate." "The estate is not yet settled," I said, "and that car was mine. I want to know the name of the dealership." "Mom." "The name, Sean." He told me, Cornerstone Classic Motors, out on Route 9. I wrote it on the notepad by the phone, the one Timothy had always kept there. Then I poured the coffee and we sat together for another hour, and I let Fanny redirect the conversation to other things, and I was very, very quiet. After they left, I sat in Timothy's armchair in the living room for a long time. I did not cry. I had done most of my crying in the first 6 months, in great exhausting waves, and what remained was something quieter and harder, more like a permanent bruise than an open wound. What I felt that night, sitting in his chair, was not grief exactly. It was something closer to the feeling you get when you know something is wrong but cannot yet name what it is. Pete Haverson called me the next morning at 7:45. He introduced himself as the owner of Cornerstone Classic Motors, and before I could say anything, he said, Mrs. Wilbur, I need you to come in today if you can. I knew your husband. I knew him well. I was at the dealership by 9. Pete was in his mid-60s, a heavy-set man with the kind of careful, deliberate manner you see in people who have spent a lot of years listening to what people aren't saying. He shook my hand in both of his and took me back to his office, past the showroom floor where 3 or 4 beautiful old cars sat under the overhead lights like exhibits in a museum. I bought the car from your son yesterday afternoon, he said. Sean came in alone. He had the title, which I now understand was your late husband's. He knew enough about the car to answer my questions, and he accepted my offer without negotiating, which is the first thing that made me uncomfortable. You knew Timothy, I said. 30 years. We were in the same car club for most of that time. He and I trailered cars to shows together. I was at your husband's service in February. He paused. About 8 months ago, before he passed, Timothy called me. He told me he was sick, that it was worse than he'd let on, and that he was worried about some things at home. He didn't elaborate much, but he asked me a favor. He slid a key across the desk. He asked me to hold onto this. He said that if anyone ever brought in that Mustang to sell, I was to call you before I did anything else, and I was to make sure you had access to the interior. I looked at the key. It was small brass, the kind that fits a lockbox. He hid something in the car, Pete said. We went out to the lot where the Mustang sat, and I stopped when I saw her and held very still for a moment. She looked exactly as she always had. Highland green, Timothy's 40 years of Sundays. I put my hand on the roof and felt the warmth of the metal in the morning sun, and I said quietly, okay. Pete showed me where. Under the rear seat, there was a compartment Timothy had built himself during a restoration phase about 12 years ago. I remembered him working on it, remembered asking what it was for, and he'd said, storage, you never know. A false bottom, very clean, very deliberate. Inside was a metal lockbox. The key fit. Inside the lockbox, there was a letter in Timothy's handwriting, and a USB drive, and a photograph of Fanny that did not look like it had been taken recently. It looked older, the clothes different, the hair a different style, and on the back of the photograph, in Timothy's precise small print, a different name. Darling Coffee, Tampa, 2014. I sat in the back seat of the Mustang, and I read the letter. Timothy had written it in November, 3 months before he died. His handwriting was slightly worse by then, but still legible, still his. Blossom, it began. If you're reading this, something happened that I hoped wouldn't but always feared might. I've been trying to find the right time to tell you this in person, and I keep running out of courage or running out of time, so I'm leaving it here because I know you'll eventually come back to this car. I know you the way I know the sound of her engine. I started being worried about Fanny about a year after Sean brought her home. Small things first. The way she asked questions about the house, the property, our finances. I thought I was being a suspicious old man. Then I started looking. The woman Sean married is not who she says she is. Her name is not Fanny Wilbur. It wasn't Fanny anything when she did this before. In Tampa, she was Darlene Coffee. She married a man named Walter Reese, whose parents were in their 70s and had a substantial estate, and over the course of 3 years, she systematically moved assets out of that family. When Walter started asking questions, she disappeared. Walter's mother lost her house. There's a man named Roy Delaney who figured most of this out. He's a private investigator in Tampa. His number is on the USB drive, along with everything I found. I couldn't go to Sean with it because he wouldn't have believed me, and I was too sick to push it, and I was afraid of losing him. That was the wrong call. I'm sorry. Take care of our son. He is not a bad man. He just has always wanted to believe the best of people, which is something he got from you. I love you. I love you. The car is yours. Don't let anyone take anything else. Tim. I sat in that car for a long time. Then I drove home, and I plugged in the USB drive, and I read everything Timothy had found. He had been thorough. He had always been thorough. It was how he'd restored the Mustang, one careful component at a time. The drive contained court records, a police report from Hillsborough County, archived social media profiles under 3 different names, and a contact file for Roy Delaney. There was also a separate document Timothy had compiled himself. A quiet, methodical summary of financial anomalies he'd noticed in conversations with Sean. Loans Sean didn't remember taking. A joint account Fanny had opened without Sean's clear understanding. Insurance policies. I called Roy Delaney that afternoon. He answered on the second ring, and when I said Timothy Wilbur's name, he went quiet for a moment and then said, "I've been wondering when this call would come." Roy had been investigating the woman Sean married, Darlene Coffey, or Karen Molly, or Patricia Sands. She had used at least 4 identities across 3 states for 4 years. He'd been hired by the Reese family in Tampa after the original incident, and in the course of that work, he'd identified 2 prior victims. An elderly widow in Savannah, whose son had been briefly married to a woman matching the description, and a family in Louisville who had lost access to a property deed under circumstances that were never formally prosecuted. The pattern was consistent. She targeted men in their late 30s to early 40s who came from families with assets, property, savings, collectibles, anything substantial and convertible. She presented as polished, successful, slightly out of the man's league, which made him feel lucky to have her. She was patient. She didn't move fast. She spent the first year or 2 building loyalty, building a sense of shared purpose. Then, slowly, she began redirecting. Small financial decisions made on his behalf. Documents he signed without reading closely enough. Assets in the extended family that could be leveraged. "She doesn't take everything at once," Roy told me. "That's what makes her hard to catch. She takes in pieces. By the time the family understands what happened, the pieces are already gone." I thought of the Mustang sitting in Pete Haverson's lot. One piece. "How do I bring this to Sean?" I asked. "You don't convince him," Roy said. "You give him a way to test it himself." I asked Sean to meet me alone, which meant I had to ask 3 times before Fanny stopped finding reasons to come along. We met at a diner 2 towns over, one neither of them frequented. I sat across from my son, and I looked at him for a moment before I said anything. He was 51 years old, and he had his father's eyes and a tension around his mouth that had been there for at least 2 years. I put the letter on the table. He read it. I watched him read it. His expression moved through several phases: disbelief, irritation, something that looked like fear, and when he finished, he set it down carefully, as if it might break. Dad thought. "Your father did not think casually about anything," I said. "You know that." "She's my wife, Mom." "I know she is. I'm not asking you to make a decision right now. I'm asking you to look at one thing." I had written down the name of the account Timothy had flagged in his notes. A savings account in Sean's name at a bank in another state, opened 18 months ago. "Do you know this account?" He looked at it. He said nothing. "Call the bank," I said. "That's all. Just call and ask about the account. If I'm wrong about everything, you lose 15 minutes. He called from the parking lot while I waited inside. He was gone for 40 minutes. When he came back in, he was pale in the way people get pale when the blood has pulled inward, away from the surface, because the body knows something bad is happening and it is preparing. He sat down. He did not speak for a long moment. "There's been activity," he said finally. "Regular transfers since September." He stopped. "I didn't open that account." I reached across the table and put my hand over his. What followed was not fast, but it was certain. Roy Delaney drove up from Tampa, and we hired a second attorney to work alongside the Tampa family's existing legal action. Sean cooperated fully. He turned over financial records, device access, everything. The picture that emerged over 3 weeks of forensic accounting was extensive. $400,000 in assets moved or compromised across various accounts, 2 fraudulent loan applications in Sean's name, and a life insurance policy on Sean himself that had been quietly modified. She had been building toward something larger. The Paris trip was not the objective. The Paris trip was a test, Roy thought, a way to gauge how easily she could move assets, how much Sean would cover for her with family. The next step, he believed, would have been the house. We brought the evidence to the county police and to a fraud unit that Roy had worked with before. They were interested. They had been looking for her under another name. She didn't know any of this was coming. Sean, to his immense credit, is a terrible liar. He had to look her in the face every day for 2 weeks while we prepared. He told me afterward that those were the hardest 14 days of his life, and I believed him. He asked me once, during that period, whether his father had hated her. "No," I said. "Your father felt sorry for her. He wrote that in the notes. He said anyone who lives the way she does must be very afraid of something." Sean thought about that for a while. "Do you think that's true?" "I think your father was more charitable than the situation required," I said. "But yes, I think it's probably true." The arrest happened on a Friday morning. She had apparently sensed something. Roy said they always do, eventually, an instinct developed over years of this life, and she'd booked a flight. Not to Paris. To somewhere with a friendlier extradition profile. Airport security stopped her at the gate. She had identification in 2 names in her bag. Sean was at our house when his attorney called with the news. He was sitting in the kitchen, at the same table where this had all begun, and he pressed his hands flat on the surface and took a long, slow breath when he heard. I made coffee. It was something to do with my hands. Pete Haverson sold the Mustang back to me for exactly what he'd paid Sean, which was less than she was worth, and which he refused to discuss as a matter of negotiation. "Tim would have done the same for me," he said, and that was the end of it. She came home on a flatbed truck on a Saturday morning in June. I stood in the driveway and watched Pete's driver ease her down the ramp, and when her wheels touched our concrete, I felt something shift in my chest, not break, not mend, something more subtle than either of those, something more like a long breath finally let go. Sean was there. He'd been coming around more often since everything happened, not in an aggressive or compensatory way, just more present, the way he'd been before Fanny. We weren't talking about the hard things yet, not most of them. We were getting back to the practice of being in the same room, which is where everything else begins. I opened the garage and he helped me push her in by hand, one of us on each side, the way Timothy and I had done 100 times. The smell of the garage rose up around us, motor oil, old leather, time. Sean ran his hand along the side panel. "I remember being in this car when I was a kid," he said. "Dad used to drive me around the neighborhood with the windows down, saying we were testing her out. We weren't testing anything. He just liked driving." "He liked having an excuse," I said. "He was like that." Sean laughed, a short, real sound. "Yeah, he was." We stood there a while in the good quiet of the garage, the Highland green paint catching the light from the single hanging bulb. Timothy had installed that bulb in 1991. He'd meant to upgrade the lighting for years and never had, and I had always quietly hoped he wouldn't. I thought about the letter in the lockbox. "I know you the way I know the sound of her engine." 36 years and he'd known, when he couldn't speak anymore, when he'd run out of time, where I would go and what I would need. That is the thing no one tells you about a long marriage. The person doesn't only live in your memory. They live in the things they knew about you. They live in the preparations they made on your behalf. They live in the choices they made for a future they knew they might not see. Timothy had loved this car, but he had hidden the truth inside her for me, not as a legacy, not as a dramatic gesture, but as a practical act of love, the kind that says, "I see you, I trust you, I know you will handle this," and that mattered more to me than the car itself, more than the arrest, more than anything that had been taken and returned. The garage smelled like 40 years of Sundays. I put my hand on the roof and left it there. "We should go through the engine this summer," Sean said after a while. "Check what needs doing. Dad had a list somewhere." "He had several lists," I said. "I know where they are." Sean nodded. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the car, and I understood that he was learning how to be in this room again, how to stand in the shadow of his father's absence without it crushing him. That takes time. It took me months, and I wasn't finished yet. But we were here. The car was here. And Timothy, in every way that a person can remain, was here too. "Okay," Sean said. "This summer, then." "This summer," I said.